We could have included Nimzowitsch's chapter about the isolated D pawn in our chapter of the pawn structure, but I want to do it separately, and there is a reason for it. Because when you talk about the pawn structure, you talk about the principles of pawn structure, but isolated pawns, one isolated pawn, D pawn, which means, for example, I'll give you an example: ED, CD, C4, knight F6, knight C3, E6, knight F3, bishop E7, CD, and knight takes D5. So we have an isolated pawn for white on D4 that is needs special attention to talk about. Now, why would white voluntarily get itself the isolated pawn? Isolated pawn on D4 gives white a little more space in the center and gives them a chance of developing an attack on a king side. For example, after castling, knight c6, white castles, and suppose black goes knight f6 back. Well, if black, I have to point that b6 is not a good move, because knight takes d5, queen takes d5, and queen c2 may create significant problem for black, because threatening bishop takes h7 as well as bishop to e4. And if black goes f5, then bishop c4 move or bishop e3 followed by bishop c4 may create some problems for black. So, but in general, how do you assess the positions with the isolated pawns such as this? This is one of the most complex types of positions probably in chess, because it's always double-edged, because black has a very nice outpost for a knight on f6, or they may retreat and after that play b6, bishop b7 and put pressure on d4 pawn, and white is gonna have, after rook e1 and possibly knight e5 in future, more space advantage and possibility for an active play. And it's always which side is better is gonna be a difficulties to determine, and it's always double-edged. So what should white do? Let's talk about this position, about knight f6. If black plays rook e1, b6, suppose bishop g5, bishop b7. Now let's talk about this position. We will go a3 to stop black's knight b4 followed by knight d5. We go a3, and now what should black do? Obviously they cannot play knight takes d4, knight takes d4, queen takes d4, and bishop takes h7, winning the queen. But what should black do here? What should black do? How will they have to put more pressure on d4 pawn? What should black play for, and what should white stay away from? Here is the position. If we take the queens off the board, and if we take the light square bishops off the board, and if we take some knights off the board, if we take these positions of these pieces off the board, then black clearly has advantage, because, as we already mentioned, the isolated pawn position is all about white's weakness against white's activity of the pieces. And if pieces gets exchanged, then weakness on d4 remains, and activity and possibility for an attack or for positional pressure disappears. So in this position, white has to try to find some way to increase the pressure. Maybe bishop c2. They cannot go queen e2 because knight will take on d4. Bishop c2. Before white starts putting some pressure on black's position, they have to bring all their pieces into the play. After rook c8, queen to d3. Actually, black may already have to play g6. But then we go queen d3, maybe rook c8 now, rook d1. And now white will try to play d5, and if black goes knight to d5, then white has several ways to play bishop h6, rook e8, and later on maybe knight to e4. Try to put pressure on the king side by playing knight g5, queen h3. But in this particular position, actually, we have to be careful because black may have a shot like knight b4, and after a takes b, knight takes b4, winning the bishop on c2. But what I wanted to talk about is not about the accidental shots like this, but as a general plan. That's what white's trying to do. White has very actively placed all their pieces, and they have some chances of attacking. Well, there are different type of isolated pawn position. Well, the same type, but different versions of it. For example, isolated pawn position, isolated pawns when one side does not have this active play. This may easily happen from the queen's gambit accepted. Knight f3, knight f6, e3, e6, bishop takes c4, a6. By the way, you can get an isolated pawn position from various different openings. From Sicilian, from Caro-Can, Sicilian with c3, from Caro-Can, from Queen's Gambit decline, from Nimzo-Indian, because it's very popular type of position. And bishop e7 or even knight d7, knight c3, c5, rook d1, c takes d, e takes d. Type of position, knight b6, bishop g5. Type remains the same, as you see, as we just had little slightly different piece location. And you know, white has an outpost on e5 for their knight, which will is very nicely placed. Black has an outpost on d5. That's the way Nimzovitch explains, and I agree with him when he says that it's double-edged, and he says it's very, actually, in Nimzovich's time, this position was more regarded as better for black because they did not have sophisticated ways, there were not known sophisticated ways for white to put pressure on the king side. It's a little bit changed, but it's a subject of discussion for a lot mostly for way advanced players. But I had to introduce this part of a pawn structure that's called one isolated pawn. As we know, one of the main aspects of positional play is the pawn structure. But pawn structure, most of the time, is connected, strictly connected with the maneuvering. So based on the pawn structure, you can build your plan and figure out how do you want to maneuver against certain pawn weaknesses. Well, and Nimzovitch very correctly and very nicely gives this example from the game where both sides have very strong and powerful knight. One knight on d5 for white and knight on d4 for black. Black also has an open file on BO open B file. But white has some advantages because, well, mainly the pawn d6 is weak. And it's white's move now, and white has to maneuver. They have very nicely placed knight on d5. Now the question is this a best position for the knight on d5? The answer is no. The best thing for white to do is to switch positions of the queen and knight. In other words, to do this. Then black is going to have significant weakness on d6, and it's going to be very difficult for them to play. So based on that, once you know what you want and you know what you're looking for, it's easy to find the correct move, which is knight to e3, followed by queen d5. And now if black plays rook b8, we can simply go b3, and our next move is queen d5, followed by knight c4. It's going to be serious problem for black. And you see, besides having strong knights, there are other aspects of this position. For example, weak pawn on d6, and also expose the pawn structure d6 and c5. So we have two pawn islands. One is a2 b2, and the other pawn island is e4 f3 g2 h2. Black has three. This is 1, this is 2, and this is 3. So knight e3 is a very strong move, attacking the weakness. It would have been better for us if we could somehow dislodge the knight on d4, but in order to get rid of strong knight on d4, we have to exchange it for our strong knight on d5. So since we don't want to do it, knight e3, rook b8, b3 remains as the best plan, best and very effective plan. And right now it's very difficult position. Let's try a couple of moves. For example, if black plays rook to b4, we can go queen d5, and after some move like a4, if black tries to get some pawns exchanged, I don't know, we may even go b takes a or knight c4. They are both very strong. Well, for example, b takes a is very strong because after rook takes a4, we can continue knight c4. You see, we're attacking the pawn on d6. And on rook takes a2, now we may have knight takes d6 with a critical attack on a rook on a2 and on pawn on f7. And if black goes rook a7, then I don't know, we can even play queen takes c5, attacking the rook, the knight, and you see that black's position is totally lost here. So black is totally lost here. So the weaknesses, something you have to notice, but then you have to learn a lot about maneuvering, maneuvering should be designed against the weaknesses.